He had never been one to chase the limelight. From his earliest years, Barron Trump had learned to navigate the paparazzi's gaze with silent composure. Yet on a brisk autumn afternoon in New York City, the spotlight found him anyway, unwelcome and undeniable. Outside a popular midtown restaurant, a small crowd of onlookers and reporters hovered, snapping photos of him, and a few friends arriving for a late lunch. Barron, 19 and quietly confident, appeared relaxed in his blazer, jeans, and simple white t-shirt, projecting a calm that belied the tensions always swirling around his famous last name. No one expected what would happen next, least of all Barron himself. Yet the atmosphere outside held that crackling potential unique to any scene involving the Trump family, as if everyone braced for something to erupt. And erupt it did. A man stepped forward, voice quivering with pent-up rage, to hurl public insults at Barron. How Barron responded would leave the entire crowd, and soon the internet at large, absolutely speechless. Julian Reyes had not planned to confront anyone that day, let alone a Trump. In his late 20s, he was a passionate liberal activist who proudly wore a rainbow pin on his lapel. A lifetime of experiences, growing up gay in a conservative household, being bullied at school, and protesting what he saw as injustices under Barron's father's administration, had lit a fire in him. Though he typically poured his energy into organized marches and community work, a chance encounter with Barron Trump was too potent to ignore. He spotted Barron on the sidewalk, heading toward the restaurant with two friends. Unused to crossing paths with a member of the Trump family in such casual circumstances, Julian felt his pulse race. Every resentment and frustration he had ever harbored surged to the surface. Before he could think twice, he found himself calling out, voice raised, venting a litany of grievances toward Barron, the family name, and everything it represented to him. Reporters and passers-by froze. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. Pedestrians who had been strolling by suddenly paused, intrigued or anxious. Julian's voice carried. He denounced Trump-era policies he deemed harmful to LGBTQ+ people, attacked the family's alleged hypocrisy, and questioned Barron's privileges. An expletive or two peppered his speech, underlining the rawness of his anger. Barron halted. His friends hung back, concern evident on their faces. Everyone expected a typical Trump-style retort, something sharp, dismissive, or mocking. A hush spread as if the city had momentarily muted itself. Julian, chest heaving, glared at Barron, ready for a fight. But Barron didn't bristle, didn't raise his voice. He simply observed Julian with a calm, almost gentle expression. Then he said, "I hear you." The simplicity of those three words took Julian off guard. The tension in the crowd was palpable. This was not the fiery comeback or combative stance that everyone had come to expect from a Trump in the face of public confrontation. Julian's breath caught in his throat, his anger suddenly checked by disbelief. Barron continued, voice steady but clear enough for onlookers to catch. "I can't pretend I know all you've been through, and I'm not responsible for everything my family has done or said. But I can listen to you, and I won't attack you for speaking your mind." Julian's bravado wavered. His heart still pounded, but Barron's refusal to strike back landed harder than any verbal punch might have. The pavement seemed to tilt beneath him. Unsure how to respond, he sputtered, "Don't try to act innocent. Your family's caused a lot of harm." Barron nodded. "I understand why you feel that way. You have every right to be upset. If you need to say more, I'll listen. I'm not here to shout at you." A stunned silence descended. Onlookers gaped, smartphones aloft, capturing every second. The city's usual noise seemed to recede. Some bystanders looked profoundly moved, others merely bewildered. Barron's measured response wasn't what anyone predicted, especially not Julian, who'd spent years steeling himself against conservative backlash. He had expected mockery, scorn, or at least an attempt to defend the Trump legacy. Instead, he faced quiet empathy. For a long, tense moment, Julian stared at Barron, wanting to cling to his anger but finding no obvious target for it. "You're just saying that because cameras are everywhere," he finally managed. Barron shrugged. "You'll believe what you want, and I can't control that. But I'm not going to deny your experiences. People get hurt by politics. sometimes badly. If we can't even hear each other, it's always going to stay like this." The confrontation, or what remained of it, dissolved. Julian's face softened, conflict evident in his eyes. In all his daydreams about confronting a Trump, he'd never imagined this outcome. Still reeling, he swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say," he confessed, voice quieter. "You don't have to say anything else," Barron replied gently. "I just hope you know I'm not your enemy, at least not by choice." A flurry of camera clicks erupted. Bewildered silence followed. Someone in the crowd whispered that they'd never seen anything like it. Then, as if propelled by an invisible nudge, Julian tentatively held out his hand. Barron blinked, then reached forward to grasp it. The handshake flashed through dozens of camera lenses, instantly immortalized. The hush in the air cracked into hushed murmuring, tinged with astonishment. Barron's friends gently steered him inside the restaurant as reporters shouted questions. Julian remained outside, grappling with conflicted emotions. The entire incident, from the first hurled insult to the unexpected handshake, had unfolded in minutes. Yet it felt like a tectonic shift, a raw example of confrontation morphing into something else entirely. That evening, Barron flipped through the flood of texts and social media messages. Some close to him praised his calm. Others asked if he'd lost his backbone by not retaliating. The media had pounced on the story, broadcasting the footage of Julian's tirade and Barron's measured response. Pundits debated whether it was a PR move, a sign of Barron's gentler nature, or something else altogether. Alone in his apartment, Barron tried to gather his thoughts. He'd grown up watching relatives and critics go at each other with fervent hostility. In that volatile climate, it had always felt more natural to stay silent. But faced with Julian's raw anger, Barron had chosen empathy. Had it been the right choice? He felt drained, yet oddly at peace. If the moment had meant anything, maybe it was that all the shouting in the world did nothing unless someone at some point tried listening. Elsewhere in the city, Julian was every bit as conflicted. He had spent the remainder of the day replaying the confrontation in his mind. He'd hurled sharp words, and Barron had offered him space to speak. It made no sense. Wasn't he supposed to be one of them? Yet Julian couldn't deny feeling surprisingly seen in that moment. It was disorienting, making him question the assumptions he'd carried about the entire Trump family. That night, Julian found himself typing a long post on social media, describing what had happened. He admitted he'd expected a fight, but Barron's calm reply had thrown him. "I'm still angry," Julian wrote. "But for the first time I wondered if the person wearing that last name might not be everything I pictured. Maybe I misjudged him. Time will tell." The post went viral, prompting an onslaught of comments, some supportive, some outraged at Julian's hint of conciliation. Days passed, and the footage of that sidewalk scene spread. Talk shows replayed it with commentary. Online debates erupted about privilege, civility, and what Barron's behavior signaled. A rumor surfaced that Barron had reached out to Julian, or that they'd exchanged messages. A few tabloids posted leaked stories with sensational headlines. "Barron Trump's soft side," or "Activist melts the cold Trump heart." Mostly clickbait, but the spectacle grew. Then one evening, Barron's phone lit up with an unknown number. He hesitated, answering only on instinct. A quiet voice came through. "Barron? It's Julian. Sorry, I know this is weird. I got your number from someone we both know." Barron's heart thumped. He sank onto his couch, suddenly wary. Hi," he said. "Everything okay?" Julian let out a shaky breath. "I'm not sure. I guess I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have launched into you like that in public. I still stand by my criticisms of certain policies, but I made it personal. And you showed more respect than I deserved." Barron closed his eyes, relief mingling with lingering tension. "No hard feelings. You had a right to be angry." A silence stretched. The city lights twinkled outside Barron's window. Finally, Julian spoke again, voice subdued. "You said you'd listen, and I realized maybe I should do the same. Is there any chance you'd meet me for coffee? Away from cameras?" Barron hesitated. He'd been conditioned to distrust these sorts of invitations, but something in Julian's voice sounded genuine. "Sure," he heard himself say. "I'd like that." They chose a small coffee shop downtown, tucked away from tourists. Barron arrived first, wearing a hoodie and cap pulled low. He scanned the room, mostly students and professionals hunched over laptops, paying him no heed. When Julian walked in, also in casual clothes, their eyes met with an awkward familiarity. They took seats in the back and ordered their drinks. At first, they danced around the confrontation. Julian asked about Barron's day-to-day life. Barron admitted he was taking specialized courses, trying to carve out his own identity separate from his father's legacy. Julian shared that he was finishing grad school and working at an LGBTQ+ youth center. Small talk, but the underlying tension remained. Eventually, Julian set down his latte. "I need to say this. I'm upset about how your family's policies affected people like me, LGBTQ+, immigrants, and others. It's personal, but I'm also realizing you're not the architect of those policies." Barron nodded. "It's complicated for me. I love my family, but I can't pretend I agree with every stance. I'm still figuring out my own beliefs." They talked for well over an hour, carefully feeling out each other's positions. Julian explained why he and so many others took offense to certain rhetoric. Barron listened, occasionally admitting he had never seen it from that angle. In turn, Julian probed Barron's personal experiences, what it was like growing up with the last name Trump, how he coped with people's assumptions. The conversation was surprisingly civil, even when they touched on hot-button issues. An odd sense of relief passed between them. Neither had to maintain the combative pose they'd adopted on the sidewalk. By the end, Julian glanced at his phone, realizing they'd been talking long enough for lunch hour to fade. He fidgeted with his rainbow pin. "This wasn't easy," he said softly. "Some of my friends would think I'm nuts for even sitting with you, but I appreciate you taking the time." Barron smiled, tired but genuine. "Likewise. I don't want to stay isolated in my own bubble either." They exchanged a hesitant handshake, then parted ways. Outside, a passing stranger might never guess these two had once faced each other down in anger. For a moment, Barron watched Julian walk off into the busy street, feeling a strange blend of hope and uncertainty. He knew the rifts that separated them, politically, personally, and socially, were huge. But he also believed those rifts might not be entirely unbridgeable. Over the next few weeks, Julian and Barron stayed in occasional contact, exchanging messages about topics ranging from politics to art. They met a couple more times, once at a small art exhibit Barron wanted to see, and once at an off-Broadway play Julian recommended. They went incognito, mindful of prying eyes. Though far from best friends, they found a certain resonance in their talks. Whenever politics came up, disagreements surfaced, but they navigated them with a cautious respect. They kept their budding rapport quiet, loath to hand it over to the gossip mill. Still, rumors trickled into the media. Paparazzi snapped a few blurry pictures of them together, spawning headlines that ranged from Barron Trump's secret liberal pal to activist Julian Reyes cozying up to the Trumps. The coverage was often ridiculous, but it stoked curiosity. Julian's activist circle was split. Some praised the dialogue, others accused him of fraternizing with the enemy. Barron, meanwhile, received texts from extended family contacts, some politely inquiring what he was up to, others bluntly warning that Julian might be using him. Despite the noise, the two continued their cautious friendship. They discovered unexpected similarities. Barron had a quiet love of Renaissance paintings. Julian enjoyed volunteering at art therapy workshops for queer youth. Both admired artists who channeled adversity into creativity, finding solace in expression rather than aggression. In a city teeming with conflict and clamor, their calm exchanges felt like a small refuge. One brisk afternoon, Julian texted Barron, "Going to a rally for LGBTQ+ homeless youth. You probably shouldn't come. Media will pounce on you. But letting you know in case you want to support in some way." Barron read the message twice. He wasn't sure if Julian was testing him. Public rallies were usually no-go zones for him, especially those likely to carry overt political messages contrary to his father's base. Still, the cause pulled at him. After some thought, he replied, "If I can show up without causing a scene, I'd like to. But I don't want to overshadow the event." Hours later, Julian was at the rally, joining a group gathered near a community center. A modest crowd held signs about housing rights and support for LGBTQ+ youth. Speeches rang out, some scathing in their criticism of conservative policies. Julian spotted a tall figure lurking at the edge of the crowd, wearing a hoodie and cap. His heart skipped. Barron had come. Barron lingered on the periphery, not wanting to disrupt. He listened to impassioned speakers who shared harrowing statistics about homelessness among gay and transgender teens. He saw tears, anger, calls to action. Though some recognized him, nobody made a public spectacle of it, either out of respect or pure shock that the youngest Trump was in attendance. When the event wrapped, Julian drifted over, searching Barron's face for any sign of regret or discomfort. Barron's expression was solemn. "I hadn't realized how severe the problem is. These kids, some are thrown out of their homes just for being who they are." He looked at Julian, sincerity stark in his eyes. "Thank you for inviting me." Julian exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It means a lot that you came, and that you listened." They parted ways quietly, but that night, images of Barron standing at the rally surfaced online. Firestorms ignited on social media. Conservatives blasted him for supporting liberal protests, while progressives were torn between cynicism and cautious praise. Talk show hosts speculated on family feuds, hinting at friction between Barron and certain Trump loyalists. Through it all, Barron refused interview requests, believing that anything he said would be spun into a soundbite. Meanwhile, Julian was scolded by some activists for letting a Trump intrude on their space. Others found it inspiring that Barron had taken a genuine interest. Despite the controversy, Barron pressed forward with his studies and life in Manhattan. He rarely posted on social media, except a few innocuous shots of cityscapes or art exhibits. Julian continued his activism, writing op-eds and organizing outreach programs for queer youth. They kept messaging each other, sometimes confiding about the backlash they each faced. Their improbable bond was tested but survived, a testament to the idea that real listening might heal more rifts than many realized. One chilly evening, Julian invited Barron to a small fundraiser for an LGBTQ+ youth shelter. Barron hesitated, fearing media frenzy, but eventually agreed, wanting to show tangible support. The event took place in a modest banquet hall. Dim lights, simple decorations, modest refreshments. A few dozen attendees, community leaders, activists, and shelter staff, mingled, quietly discussing the challenges of underfunded programs. Barron slipped in with little fanfare, wearing a simple suit. Julian spotted him and gave a welcoming nod. Some recognized him with surprise, though no one made a scene. As the evening progressed, speakers took the mic, sharing personal stories of survival. Teens expelled from their homes, young adults grappling with addiction and mental health crises. Barron listened intently, moved by the depth of their struggles. Then, near the end of the program, a teenage girl approached Barron cautiously. "You're Barron, right?" she asked, eyes flicking up to meet his. "I used to live in a shelter like this. I was so scared all the time." She swallowed, twisting her fingers. "I wanted to say thanks for coming. It's weird for me because I've heard so much about your father, but you're here. I'm not sure I get it, but thanks." Barron was momentarily struck speechless. He thought back to all the heated debates, the policies that had often overshadowed the personal realities of marginalized communities. "You don't need to thank me," he finally replied. "I'm the one who should be thanking you for sharing your story." They exchanged a brief smile before she moved on. Julian, observing from across the room, felt a surge of respect for Barron's willingness to be present, despite the weight his name carried. The event wound down quietly, with guests trickling out. As Barron headed for the exit, Julian caught his arm. "Thank you," Julian said, a slight catch in his voice. "I know this can't be easy for you, or for them, seeing your last name here." Barron nodded. "It's important, though. I never really realized how many people are affected by these issues until I stepped out of my usual world." He paused. I appreciate that you've given me a chance to see it." They stepped outside into the cold. The city's nightlights reflected off puddles in the street. For a moment they stood under a battered awning, watching cabs pass by in the orange glow of street lamps. Julian extended his hand one more time. This time, Barron offered not just a handshake but a brief, grateful clasp of Julian's shoulder. Outside of the media glare, they had come to a better understanding of each other, bridging a divide that once seemed impassable. Inevitably, photos from the fundraiser found their way online, igniting fresh debates. Family allies questioned Barron's allegiances. Liberal activists doubted his sincerity. Commentators insisted it was a soft rebranding of the Trump image, while others called it a quiet sign of generational change. Barron, resisting the swirl, remained mostly silent in public. Only in private did he admit to Julian that the tension with certain members of his family was growing. He didn't relish defying them, but he felt compelled by what he had learned. Julian, too, navigated blowback. He wrote an op-ed piece defending the idea of honest conversation. In it, he never named Barron directly, but he alluded to how real change requires stepping out of our echo chambers and seeing the humanity in those we label our enemies. Some applauded, while others condemned him for naivety. Still, he pressed on with his work, convinced that bridging divides even tentatively was worthwhile. In a moment of candor over the phone, Barron admitted, "I'm torn. My name brings cameras, and that can overshadow the causes I want to help. But if staying away means ignoring what's happening, that feels worse." Julian's response was gentle. "Maybe there's a middle ground. If you're sincere, there are ways to help quietly, through donations, volunteer work without the spotlight. But I think your presence can also send a message that compassion doesn't have to be political." Barron sighed. "That's what I want, honestly. But it's like everyone else decides what my actions mean before I can open my mouth." Julian laughed softly. "Welcome to activism in the social media age. None of us get to control the narrative completely. We just do what we believe is right." As the winter holidays approached, the swirling speculation about Barron's political turn began to die down, replaced by fresh headlines on other controversies. Barron quietly continued his studies, occasionally texting Julian about upcoming events, articles on social justice, or random links to interesting art exhibits. Their unlikely friendship never became a media fixture. It stayed personal, built on private conversations and a shared belief that shouting matches accomplish little if no one listens. An unexpected invitation arrived in December, a charity gala to benefit a nonprofit supporting homeless LGBTQ+ youth. The organizers had extended an invitation to both Julian and Barron, aware, presumably, that their story could help highlight the charity's work. Unsure if he should attend, Barron wrestled with the potential blowback. Ultimately, he decided it was too important to decline. The gala was modestly glamorous, hosted in a converted warehouse with soft lighting and a makeshift stage. Barron entered with a polite smile, exchanging nods and handshakes with guests who recognized him. Julian, wearing a neat blazer and his trademark rainbow pin, greeted him warmly at the entrance. The tension was palpable. Some attendees eyed Barron with caution, others with curiosity. Over the course of the evening, speakers came forward to share personal accounts of navigating homelessness or family rejection. Music played. A silent auction raised funds. Barron remained somewhat in the background, but whenever someone approached him, he listened attentively. Toward the end of the night, Julian found him standing near a large window that overlooked the city lights. "How are you holding up?" Julian asked quietly, sensing Barron's introspection. Barron turned, expression pensive. "I'm okay. It's just heavy hearing all these stories. There's so much pain. And to think some of our country's policies might make life even harder for these folks." He hesitated. "I don't agree with everything my father did in office, but I also never spoke out. I feel conflicted about that." Julian nodded, sympathy and empathy in his eyes. "I get it. Family loyalty is complicated. But you're here now, trying to help. That counts." In that moment, a teenage boy, perhaps 17, approached shyly. "Excuse me, I just wanted to say thanks for coming, both of you." He glanced at Barron, then at Julian. "It's weird because I used to think no one from your side of the fence would ever care about us. But maybe I was wrong." Barron's voice was soft. "I'm sorry if you ever felt that way. If I can do anything, well, I'm here to learn how." The teen nodded, eyes bright with cautious hope, before shuffling away. Julian and Barron exchanged a look, each understanding the significance of the exchange. Sometimes a single conversation, a single gesture, could be a small but meaningful spark. After the gala, as the crowd dispersed, a few cameras flashed outside, capturing Barron and Julian walking together. One reporter yelled a question. "Barron, are you shifting your political views? Are you renouncing your father's policies?" Barron tensed, glancing at Julian, who shook his head in warning. Sometimes silence spoke more than any rushed statement. They slipped into the cold night, the event behind them, the future uncertain. In the days that followed, coverage of the gala circulated. Many outlets noted Barron's presence in measured tones, focusing on the money raised for charity. Others speculated about a new era for the Trump name. Online, opinions were as polarized as ever. Some lauded Barron's openness, while others dismissed it as a stunt. Barron himself declined interviews, not wanting to overshadow the cause. Julian, fielding calls from fellow activists, chose to focus on the success of the fundraiser. Enough funds had been raised to expand shelter capacity. That was what mattered. As the winter gave way to early spring, the hostility that once framed Barron and Julian's relationship seemed almost distant. The city continued at its restless pace, new controversies and headlines replacing old ones. Barron and Julian, meanwhile, forged a cautious but genuine bond. They met when they could, over coffee, at quiet museum visits, or in half-empty theaters for matinee shows. They disagreed on plenty of political topics, but approached each conversation with an unspoken rule of empathy. They knew their story was an exception in a deeply divided climate, but it gave them both a sense of purpose. If two people as different as they were could find common ground, maybe there was hope for more. One afternoon, strolling along the High Line, Barron admitted, "Sometimes I think about that day, how you confronted me in front of everyone. If you hadn't done that, I'd probably still be avoiding these conversations." Julian glanced over, hands jammed in his coat pockets against the chill. "Yeah, I was out of line," he said, lips tightening in a hint of regret. "But you responded with kindness instead of hostility. I never expected that." Barron gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I didn't see the point of yelling back. You were already hurt, already angry. All I could do was listen." They reached a scenic overlook, the city's skyline sprawling out before them. Sunlight glinted off the glass towers. Julian inhaled. "I guess that's the biggest lesson for me. Sometimes the bravest answer to anger is empathy. I didn't think anyone from your family was capable of it, but you proved me wrong." Barron leaned on the railing, gaze distant. "We're all individuals. I can't erase the past, and I know people are still angry for valid reasons. But if listening can build any sort of bridge, I want to keep doing it." They stood in companionable silence, two unlikely allies who had begun as adversaries. The hush that had descended on that sidewalk months ago still echoed in their memories, a moment when time froze, when the usual rules of political warfare dissolved. Barron's measured words, "I hear you," had disarmed Julian's anger, sparking a journey that led here to cautious friendship and mutual respect. Their story didn't end with a grand political statement or a sweeping policy change. Instead, it persisted in the smaller moments, the conversations that might never go viral, the private expansions of empathy that only a few would witness. Both knew their connection was fragile, subject to the pressures of public perception and familial expectations. Yet they kept trying. Because if a handshake on a crowded sidewalk could break the cycle of hostility, maybe more such moments could push an entire culture toward understanding. Months later, a quiet dinner invitation appeared, a small fundraiser for a community center with an emphasis on bridging political divides. Julian was set to give a short speech. He sent Barron an invite, half expecting him to politely decline. After all, these gatherings often attracted loud critics of the Trump family, but Barron chose to attend. When he arrived, the chatter in the room briefly hushed, then resumed. The event featured speakers from across the political spectrum, sharing stories about uniting to support youth in need. As Julian took the stage to speak, Barron listened from a back table, his eyes fixed on Julian's earnest expression. Julian's remarks were about empathy, about how he once thought of the other side as irredeemable, and how a single unexpected encounter changed his perspective. He never named Barron, but those who knew their story understood. It wasn't a glossy endorsement of the Trump brand, far from it. Julian still voiced strong objections to certain policies and rhetoric, but he praised the power of conversation, of meeting an individual where they were. When he stepped off stage, Julian saw Barron waiting for him. Their eyes locked, and Julian smiled, a little breathless from public speaking. Barron nodded his approval. No words needed. The rest of the evening flowed easily. By now, the novelty of seeing them together had dimmed, replaced by a cautious acceptance that perhaps people from opposing ends of a great divide could, in fact, share the same space. As the night ended, Julian and Barron stepped outside into the hum of New York traffic. Headlights swept across the pavement. They said their goodbyes, each aware that their story had moved from confrontation to something deeper. They might never align perfectly on politics, and the public might always question the sincerity of this bond, but they chose to keep talking, keep listening, and keep challenging each other to see the person beyond the label. Walking away from the venue, Barron remembered again that hushed moment on the sidewalk, Julian's rage, his own decision to simply acknowledge it. The hush that followed had been more powerful than any shouting match. In that silence, a bridge had begun to form, built not on agreement, but on understanding that each of them was more than the stereotypes that defined them. And in a world where conflict seemed more profitable than compassion, that single act of empathy, saying, "I hear you," had indeed left everyone silent, and maybe just a little more open to the possibility of change.